In the heart of a valley surrounded by jagged cliffs and dense, whispering forests lay a village unlike any other. Its paths were narrow and winding, carved from stone and earth over generations, and its houses stood close together as if leaning on one another for courage. Life in the village was dictated by strict rules, some written in ancient scrolls and others spoken in hushed warnings by elders who carried the weight of fear like a mantle. Every action, every word, and even every glance could be scrutinized for signs of disrespect toward the unseen forces that governed their lives. From dawn to dusk, the villagers lived in a tense rhythm, their hearts beating to the cadence of caution, for it was said that the spirits of the forest and the ancestors themselves watched their every move. Amid this landscape of fear and tradition lived Lami, a young woman whose presence carried both serenity and power. She was known throughout the village for her hands that moved with an almost magical precision. With them she could mend wounds that others deemed untreatable, craft charms that whispered blessings over the homes of the sick, and weave herbs and oils into potions that eased pain and brought clarity to the mind. Her skill was a rare gift, one that drew people to her doorstep in hopes of healing, guidance, and protection. Mothers whispered her name to their children as a promise that help existed even in the darkest hours, and even the village's own warriors, gruff and stoic, sought her aid when illness or injury struck. Yet, the admiration she inspired was not without its shadows. The male elders, those who had long governed the village and held sway over both its people and its spiritual codes, felt a stir of unease whenever Lami entered their council hall. Her reputation had grown steadily, and with it, a quiet influence that seemed to ripple through the villagers. They feared that her power, subtle and undeniable, might one day overshadow their authority. Whispers began to circulate, faint but persistent, suggesting that Lami's hands were not merely skilled but imbued with a kind of forbidden force, a connection to spirits that she could control at will. It was the old story retold in new fear. When a woman's gifts rise above the control of men, chaos often follows. Despite these murmurs, Lami herself remained humble. She carried out her work with a quiet dignity, her hands moving in the dance of healing and creation, oblivious to the storm gathering in the council hall. Still, even she felt the first stirrings of unease, a shadow at the edge of her vision during twilight walks, and an occasional chill when her name was spoken in the elders' chambers. The village, for all its beauty and ritual, was a place where kindness could be mistaken for defiance, where the spirit of envy could lurk in the guise of concern. And though Lami did not yet know it, the envy harbored by the elders would soon erupt in a punishment designed to break her body but could never break her spirit. The hands that healed and protected would be taken, but the strength of her will and the unseen bond with forces far beyond the village's understanding would rise in a form that would shake them all to their very core. In this place of fear and reverence, Lami's story was about to begin, not with triumph but with trial, and yet the trial would reveal a power that no punishment could ever erase. Her hands, sacred and skilled, might be lost to cruelty, but something far darker, far stronger, would awaken in their place, and the village would come to know that the measure of a healer's strength is not held in flesh alone, but in the shadow that follows and protects. In the weeks that followed Lami's rise as the village's most gifted healer, a subtle tension began to ripple through the streets and alleys. At first, it was little more than a shiver of unease, a glance that lingered too long, a whisper caught in the wind. A basket of fruit rotted inexplicably in a trader's stall, a well ran murky overnight, and livestock fell sick without explanation. The villagers, steeped in fear and superstition, found it easy to blame these strange events on the one person whose hands had always wrought miracles. Lami, they said, had which hands that could bend not just herbs and charms but the will of the unseen. The elders, proud and wary, fanned the embers of suspicion. They twisted every act of Lami's kindness into proof of her growing power over the spirits. When she tended a child with a fever that no other healer could touch, they whispered among themselves that she had stolen the child's vitality to strengthen her own magic. When she stitched a wound cleanly, leaving no scar, they muttered that her hands held more than skill, they held dominion. Even the most loyal villagers began to look at her differently, their eyes clouded with uncertainty, their smiles frail and hesitant. It was not long before avoidance became the norm. Mothers called their children inside at her approach, tradesmen shut their doors quietly, and even those whose lives she had saved turned their backs, unwilling to be near the source of their fear. Lami walked through the village square with a sense of quiet dignity, her movements fluid and deliberate, yet she could feel the cold weight of suspicion pressing against her from every corner. She sensed the shift, the way shadows seemed to cling more closely to her path, how even the birds would take flight at her step. Her hands, once symbols of hope and creation, began to take on a new meaning in the eyes of the village. They were feared, yes, but also envied, and slowly they became a symbol of defiance against a society that could not tolerate power in the hands of one it did not control. When children whispered her name in excitement, adults shushed them with caution, fearing the attention might draw the wrath of spirits or worse, the ire of the elders. Every word, every glance, every gesture of hers was scrutinized, interpreted, and mistrusted. Yet Lami remained steadfast. She continued her work quietly, stitching, blending, and tending to the ill with the same care as before, refusing to let fear dictate her actions. And still the elders' words spread like wildfire, growing into stories of dark nights and restless spirits, tales of hands that could curse as easily as they could heal. The villagers began to see signs where none existed, shadows moving unnaturally in corners, breezes that whispered her name, and the flicker of lanterns in homes where she had not set foot. Each incident, each unexplained misfortune, fed the growing legend of her witch hands. What had once been admired as divine skill was now whispered about in fear, transforming the hands that gave life into symbols of danger and rebellion. And in this growing fear, the stage was quietly set, the threads of envy and suspicion woven into a net that would soon snap, leading to a punishment designed not just to wound flesh, but to challenge the very spirit that Lami carried within her. You said, the accusation, 600 words. During a drought, the elders accuse Lami of angering the gods. They claim her hands have stolen the village's fortune and demand a cleansing ritual. Her protests are silenced by threats, and she is taken before the council to face judgment. The village prepares for a cruel ceremony. ChatGPT said. The drought had come like a shadow creeping over the valley, stretching its dry fingers across every field and home. Crops withered under the relentless sun, rivers receded to shallow puddles, and the air became thick with dust and despair. The villagers, whose lives depended on the rhythm of the seasons, grew anxious and restless, whispering prayers and offering small sacrifices to appease unseen forces. In the midst of this growing panic, the elders convened in their hall of stone, the walls heavy with the weight of tradition and the oppressive heat of the day. Their faces, usually composed and imperious, were now lined with worry, and beneath it something darker, fear and envy of the young healer whose hands had always brought blessings, but whose growing influence now threatened their authority. It did not take long for suspicion to find its mark. The elders declared that the gods themselves had been angered, that Lami's hands, so skilled in creation and healing, had somehow stolen the fortune of the village. It is she who twists the spirits to her will, one elder whispered, voice tight with dread. The rivers dry, the harvests fail, and the sun scorches all because she has claimed what belongs to the village. Others nodded, their faces pale but stern, and soon the murmurs became declarations. Lami, they said, must be held accountable. Her kindness, once celebrated, was now recast as manipulation. Her talents, once admired, were now the tools of transgression. Word spread quickly through the village. Mothers drew their children close and spoke of caution. Traders hesitated to seek her aid, and neighbors avoided her doorway. The village square, which had once echoed with gratitude for her healing, now buzzed with gossip and whispered accusations. Despite this, Lami continued to care for the sick and tend the injured, her calm demeanor unshaken by the growing storm of hostility. But the elders were unrelenting. They claimed a cleansing ritual was necessary, a public demonstration of punishment that would appease the gods and restore balance to the land. The threat was clear: refuse and the consequences would fall upon her alone, but the village would not escape the wrath of the unseen forces. When Lami attempted to speak, to protest her innocence and plead her loyalty to both the villagers and the spirits, her words were cut short. One elder stepped forward, a carved staff in hand, and declared that defiance would not be tolerated. The gods do not hear those who twist their blessings, he intoned, and the hall fell silent, the sound of her own heartbeat loud in her ears. Her protests, her explanations, her cries for reason, all were met with threats of exile, pain, and disgrace. The council's decision was unanimous. She was to be brought before them for judgment, her fate sealed by fear and superstition rather than truth. That night, as the sun sank behind the jagged cliffs, the village prepared for the ceremony. Torches were lit along the paths, casting flickering shadows across the square where the ritual would take place. Villagers gathered, a mixture of curiosity and dread etched on their faces. Some wondered if this was justice. Others feared the consequences of crossing the elders. Lami was escorted through the streets, her head held high, her hands bound, the murmurs of the crowd washing over her like waves. And all the while, her shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should, flickering and quivering as if sensing the trial to come, hinting at a power that no punishment could extinguish. The stage was set, the village silent with anticipation, and the cruel ceremony loomed, a moment where flesh would be broken, authority asserted, and the hands that healed might be lost forever. Yet even as the elders prepared their rites, none could foresee that the true force o. The drought had come like a shadow creeping over the valley, stretching its dry fingers across every field and home. Crops withered under the relentless sun, rivers receded to shallow puddles, and the air became thick with dust and despair. The villagers whose lives depended on the rhythm of the seasons, grew anxious and restless, whispering prayers and offering small sacrifices to appease unseen forces. In the midst of this growing panic, the elders convened in their hall of stone, the walls heavy with the weight of tradition and the oppressive heat of the day. Their faces, usually composed and imperious, were now lined with worry, and beneath it something darker, fear and envy of the young healer whose hands had always brought blessings, but whose growing influence now threatened their authority. It did not take long for suspicion to find its mark. The elders declared that the gods themselves had been angered, that Lami's hands, so skilled in creation and healing, had somehow stolen the fortune of the village. "It is she who twists the spirits to her will," one elder whispered, voice tight with dread. "The rivers dry, the harvests fail, and the sun scorches all because she has claimed what belongs to the village." Others nodded, their faces pale but stern, and soon the murmurs became declarations. Lami, they said, must be held accountable. Her kindness, once celebrated, was now recast as manipulation. Her talents, once admired, were now the tools of transgression. Word spread quickly through the village. Mothers drew their children close and spoke of caution. Traders hesitated to seek her aid, and neighbors avoided her doorway. The village square, which had once echoed with gratitude for her healing, now buzzed with gossip and whispered accusations. Despite this, Lami continued to care for the sick and tend the injured, her calm demeanor unshaken by the growing storm of hostility. But the elders were unrelenting. They claimed a cleansing ritual was necessary, a public demonstration of punishment that would appease the gods and restore balance to the land. The threat was clear: refuse and the consequences would fall upon her alone, but the village would not escape the wrath of the unseen forces. When Lami attempted to speak, to protest her innocence and plead her loyalty to both the villagers and the spirits, her words were cut short. One elder stepped forward, a carved staff in hand, and declared that defiance would not be tolerated. "The gods do not hear those who twist their blessings," he intoned, and the hall fell silent, the sound of her own heartbeat loud in her ears. Her protests, her explanations, her cries for reason, all were met with threats of exile, pain, and disgrace. The council's decision was unanimous. She was to be brought before them for judgment, her fate sealed by fear and superstition rather than truth. That night, as the sun sank behind the jagged cliffs, the village prepared for the ceremony. Torches were lit along the paths, casting flickering shadows across the square where the ritual would take place. Villagers gathered, a mixture of curiosity and dread etched on their faces. Some wondered if this was justice. Others feared the consequences of crossing the elders. Lami was escorted through the streets, her head held high, her hands bound, the murmurs of the crowd washing over her like waves. And all the while, her shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should, flickering and quivering as if sensing the trial to come, hinting at a power that no punishment could extinguish. The stage was set, the village silent with anticipation, and the cruel ceremony loomed, a moment where flesh would be broken, authority asserted, and the hands that healed might be lost forever. Yet even as the elders prepared their rites, none could foresee that the true force of Lami's spirit had already begun to awaken, a shadowed power that would rise to defy cruelty and deliver a justice that no law or council could command. The moon hung low over the village square, casting silver light on the assembled crowd, their faces pale and tense, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Torches flickered along the edges of the plaza, throwing long trembling shadows that danced across the stone and earth, as if the land itself recoiled from what was about to happen. Lami stood at the center, her arms bound before her, her head lifted high despite the weight of the night and the gathering horror around her. Her eyes, deep and unwavering, burned with a quiet defiance that seemed to pierce the hearts of all who looked upon her. The elders moved with ceremony, their ritual knives glinting in the torchlight, and the villagers watched in stunned silence, knowing they were about to witness an act of cruelty that could not be unseen. The first strike came swiftly and the world seemed to hold its breath. Lami's hands were severed with a precision that belied the violence of the act, and the sound of flesh cutting through the air echoed like a harsh drumbeat against the hushed murmurs of the crowd. Yet she did not scream. Not even a whimper passed her lips. Instead, a whisper, low and almost drowned by the wind, slithered from between them, a curse that wound around the hearts of those who had condemned her. Her words were a thread of darkness, a promise that the injustice done this night would not go unanswered. Blood pooled at her feet, seeping into the earth, darkening the soil that had once nurtured her family and her people. It flowed like a river of warning, a mark of what had been taken and a signal to powers beyond mortal comprehension. The villagers shivered, some turning away, unwilling to see the full weight of the act, while others remained rooted, unable to look anywhere but at her. Lami's body trembled slightly, a shiver of pain, yet her gaze never faltered. Her eyes held fire, a calm, controlled blaze that spoke of endurance and strength far beyond what the elders had anticipated. And then, even as her body collapsed to the ground, something impossible happened. Her shadow did not follow the laws of the mortal coil. It moved with intention, stretching across the plaza, twisting and flickering in ways that defied logic. It rose as if independent of her broken form, dark and solid, yet alive, mirroring her thoughts, her anger, and her whispered vow of vengeance. The villagers gasped as they saw it take form, a shape that was hers yet not hers, a silent sentinel born of cruelty and injustice. The elders, who had believed themselves in control, felt a tremor of fear creep into their hearts. The ritual was complete, the punishment delivered, and yet something far greater had been awakened. Lami's hands were gone, but her spirit, intertwined with shadow and curse, remained unbroken. The square, once filled with anticipation and triumph at her supposed defeat, now resonated with a deep, unsettling tension. Whispers spread through the crowd, questions unspoken, eyes darting toward the dark shape that lingered in the moonlight. Had they truly punished her, or had they merely unleashed a force they could not contain? In that silent, cold night, the villagers learned a truth they would not soon forget. Flesh can be cut, bones can be broken, but the spirit, the shadow that grows from pain and defiance, cannot be so easily restrained. And as Lami's body lay still on the earth, her shadow prowled, silent yet commanding, a harbinger of a justice that would shake the village to its very core. Lami awoke to a world of silence, the cold earth pressing against her torn body, the moonlight stark and unyielding above. The elders had left her at the edge of the forest, abandoned to die among twisted roots and tangled underbrush, as if the wilderness itself could cleanse the village of what they considered a threat. Pain radiated from where her hands had been, sharp and unrelenting, yet through it all, her breath remained steady, her mind alert, her spirit unwilling to yield. The forest, usually alive with rustling creatures and the calls of night birds, remained unervingly still. Even the beasts, sensitive to the world's unseen energies, avoided her presence, retreating into shadows and thick foliage as though sensing something sacred and untouchable in her suffering. Her tears fell freely, warm and wet against the cool night air. As each droplet touched the ground, it seemed to awaken a strange movement within her shadow. It rippled and swirled like dark water, stretching and twisting beyond the bounds of her body. The shadow no longer mimicked her motions, it acted with purpose, alive in a way that defied logic, a silent witness to her pain and a vessel of a power the villagers could never comprehend. With every heartbeat, it grew stronger, more fluid, more resolute, carrying with it the promise that cruelty could wound flesh but never extinguish spirit. As the hours passed, the forest seemed to carry whispers of her name. The wind moved differently here, brushing past leaves and through the trees with soft, deliberate sighs. Lami? Lami? It was as if the earth itself had taken note of the injustice, the air bending to speak her presence aloud, to carry her story beyond the reach of mortal ears. Even in her weakened state, a sense of connection to something vast and eternal filled her, intertwining her grief with purpose. The wilderness that was meant to be her tomb instead became her refuge and her forge. Pain, sorrow, and rage melded into a singular strength, and her shadow became a silent companion, restless and attentive, waiting for the moment to rise. The forest, the wind, and the creatures within it all seemed to recognize the shift. Something had been awakened, and it would not rest until the balance had been restored. In that quiet, moonlit night, Lami's survival was no longer just a matter of flesh. It was the birth of a force that would soon shake the village to its foundations. The night was thick with silence, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves as Lami lay sprawled on the cold forest floor, her body weak and battered. Blood had soaked into the earth, and the pain from her severed hands radiated like fire through her arms, yet her mind remained astonishingly clear. Somewhere between consciousness and the edge of oblivion she felt a shift, a stirring in the air around her, a movement that did not belong to any living creature. Her shadow, once tethered faithfully to her form, began to quiver unnaturally, stretching and twisting in ways that defied the angles of moonlight. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, it lifted from the ground, detaching itself from the weight of her body. It took shape, mimicking her form but with a presence sharper, stronger, and darker than any mere reflection. Its edges shimmered like smoke, and in its grasp appeared a blade of pure moonlight, a weapon forged not of steel but of essence, cold and radiant at once. The shadow moved with intent, a silent sentinel of vengeance, and Lami, though weakened, could sense its consciousness, its awareness intertwined with her own pain and determination. A whisper broke through the stillness, resonant yet soft, carrying an echo of her own voice. They cut flesh, not spirit. It was not a voice of anger but of unwavering clarity, a promise that the cruelty inflicted upon her body could not extinguish what truly belonged to her, the strength, the courage, and the power of her being. The words seeped into her like fire through water, igniting a spark within her that had seemed extinguished under the weight of despair. As the shadow hovered over her, Lami felt her own essence stirring, a tether of will connecting her to this newly awakened force. Pain and weakness swirled within her, but they became fuel rather than restraint. The shadow responded, flowing toward her, intertwining with the last flickers of life in her body, creating a bond stronger than blood, stronger than flesh. Her senses sharpened. She could feel the forest around her, the soil beneath, the subtle shift of the wind, all bending toward her renewed will. Together, body and shadow began to rise. Lami pulled herself from the ground, unsteady at first, yet driven by a force she had never known. The shadow moved beside her, independent yet inseparable, a guardian and a weapon all at once. The moonlight blade shimmered in the darkness, catching the edges of leaves and stones, casting fragmented patterns across the forest floor that danced with anticipation. Every step she took resonated with the promise of retribution, and the forest seemed to acknowledge her awakening, the air vibrating with energy, charged and expectant. In that liminal space between life and death, Lami's body and shadow became one in purpose. She was no longer merely a healer, no longer merely a victim of cruelty. She had become something beyond mortal fear, a force of reckoning, a living emblem of defiance. And as she rose fully to her feet, the shadow whispered again, soft but resolute, "They cut flesh, not spirit." The words carried forward into the night, a herald of the storm to come, as Lami and her shadow prepared to reclaim the balance that had been stolen from her. The first death came before dawn, when the village still lay shrouded in mist and half-light. A scream had rent the air hours earlier, sharp and chilling, but it had quickly been replaced by an eerie silence that settled over the streets like a shroud. When the villagers approached the hut of Elder Oba, they found it abandoned, or at least, emptied of life in the way they understood it. His body lay sprawled across the floor, limbs twisted unnaturally, his throat and chest sliced cleanly as if cut by a blade that existed somewhere between shadow and reality. No weapon was found, no hand that could claim responsibility. Only the signs of something far darker than human malice. The hut's walls were smeared with black streaks, jagged and deliberate, forming crude hand-shaped markings that seemed to claw outward, reaching toward anyone who dared to look. The floor was sticky with the dark residue of his blood, mingled with something impossible, a shadowy substance that clung to the edges of the boards and furniture, moving subtly as though alive. Villagers stood at the threshold, their faces pale, mouths open, hearts hammering in disbelief and terror. They whispered among themselves, fear overtaking rational thought, and the words that finally emerged were unanimous. The shadow had returned. No one had dared speak of Lami openly for weeks, yet now, in the face of this unexplainable horror, her name rippled through the crowd like a sudden gust of wind. The handless woman, they murmured, voices trembling, eyes darting to every corner of the hut, every flicker of darkness beyond the torchlight. Mothers clutched their children, traitors froze in place, and even the bravest youths found themselves rooted to the spot, staring at the shadowed doorway as if expecting it to leap forward. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying whispers that seemed not entirely natural, fragments of her name and the faint echo of a promise. They had cut flesh but not spirit. Each villager felt it, a prickling along the skin, a shiver that spoke of unseen eyes watching, waiting, and judging. In that moment, the village understood that the cruelty they had inflicted on Lami had awakened a force beyond their comprehension, a power not just of vengeance but of relentless, inevitable reckoning. Elder Oba's death was only the beginning. The hand-shaped markings on the walls, the absence of a weapon, and the palpable fear that swept through the village made one truth painfully clear. Lami's shadow had returned, and it was far beyond the control of mortal hands. The villagers, shaken to their very cores, could only retreat, murmuring prayers and warnings as the darkness outside the hut seemed to pulse with the promise of more to come. Night descended on the village like a suffocating veil, each star dimmed by the weight of fear that had settled over the streets and homes. The first death had shattered the fragile sense of safety, but it was only the beginning. Each night thereafter, a new elder would vanish, leaving the villagers in a state of mounting terror. The ritualistic nature of the deaths was undeniable. Each elder was found lifeless in their hut, their faces frozen in expressions of shock and disbelief. There were no cuts, no bruises, no signs of struggle, nothing that could be traced to human hands. The only evidence left behind was the faintest impression burned into the chest of the fallen. A dark silhouette shaped unmistakably like a shadow, a mark seared not by fire but by an unseen, supernatural force. Panic spread faster than the fires in the hearths, infecting every corner of the village. No one dared sleep without a light burning, no window remained unbarred, no door left unlocked. Yet the light offered no comfort. It could not pierce the dense, creeping darkness that seemed to follow every villager, curling along the edges of walls, slipping beneath floorboards, or waiting in the corners of their vision. Shadows no longer obeyed the laws of the sun. They stretched, lingered, and twisted unnaturally. Mothers held children close, whispering prayers that went unanswered, while men who had once carried authority trembled at the slightest movement in their homes. Every rustle of leaves, every groan of wood in the night became a harbinger of doom. The villagers began to speak of her curse not as metaphor or threat, but as a tangible, living presence. They whispered that Lami's hands might have been severed, but her essence, her will, and the power she commanded through her shadow were as alive as any being. Even the most skeptical could no longer deny it, for each death was precise, deliberate, and inescapable. Patterns emerged, and with them a growing realization. This was not vengeance enacted in haste or anger. It was meticulous, deliberate, and terrifyingly intelligent. The shadow that had been born from pain and defiance had become an instrument of judgment, carrying with it the memory of cruelty and injustice. Villagers huddled together in their homes, shivering in terror, yet no fortification could contain what moved unseen. Fires burned low, candles flickered, and yet the dark presence slipped past unperturbed. Dreams became restless, filled with whispers and shapes, and even those who had done nothing wrong found themselves staring at the corners of their rooms in fear. The village's social order, built on hierarchy and fear, began to crumble. No council could organize safety, no prayers could summon protection, and the elders who had once ruled with imperious authority were now the hunted, trembling in silence. By the seventh night, the villagers understood fully that Lami's curse was not idle words, not threats or superstition. It was a living, breathing force. It moved with intention, discernment, and relentless determination. The shadow did not act indiscriminately. It punished only those who had turned cruelty into law, those who had sought to sever her spirit with knives and fear. And as the village cowered beneath the suffocating weight of dread, it became chillingly clear that no wall, no light, no human action could stop it. Lami's vengeance, carried through shadow and spirit, had become an unstoppable force, reshaping the very understanding of power, fear, and justice in the hearts of all who witnessed it. The first hints of dawn barely brushed the horizon when a ripple of movement appeared at the village gates. The fog clinging to the earth parted slightly, revealing a figure shrouded in cloth, her silhouette liminal and ethereal. Lami had returned. Her arms were wrapped tightly in linen, not to hide wounds but to signify the rebirth of power forged through suffering. She moved with deliberate grace, each step purposeful, the weight of her presence alone sending a shiver through those who dared to watch from shuttered windows. Her body, though scarred and marked by cruelty, carried a quiet authority that demanded attention, the kind that silences whispers and forces the world to acknowledge it. But it was not Lami alone who returned to the village that day. Behind her, a shadow stretched and flowed independently, a living extension of her will. It moved with uncanny fluidity, every gesture precise and deliberate, yet terrifyingly unbound by mortal limitations. In its hand glimmered a blade of black flame, jagged and spectral, radiating a cold light that made the edges of the cobblestone shimmer and the torches along the street flicker as if afraid. The shadow did not simply follow her. It anticipated, scanned, and judged, embodying the vengeance and justice that had festered during the nights she had lain abandoned in the forest. The villagers, long consumed by fear, felt their hearts seize at the sight. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered, and even the bravest among them could not move. Mothers clutched their children close, priests muttered hurried prayers, and merchants abandoned carts mid-street. The surviving elders, those who had orchestrated her mutilation and stood as symbols of cruelty and tyranny, now felt the full weight of what they had unleashed. They staggered from their homes, trembling, and fell to their knees on the cold earth at the sight of her. Words failed them. They raised hands, bowed heads, tears streaking the grime on their faces, and begged for forgiveness in voices cracked by fear. Lami's gaze, calm yet unyielding, swept over them. She did not speak. There was no need for words. Her presence carried the weight of all the nights she had survived, all the pain she had endured, and all the justice that had waited in silence for its moment. Her shadow, however, was unrestrained by mercy. The black flame blade moved independently, slicing through the air with the precision of inevitability, casting jagged shadows across the kneeling elders' faces. Each flicker of the weapon seemed to trace the lines of guilt on their skin, marking them visibly with the consequences of their deeds. The villagers could only watch in awe and terror as the shadow enacted judgment in ways that were both symbolic and terrifyingly literal. Every movement, every swing of the blade, was precise, never missing its mark and leaving a lingering reminder of the pain once inflicted upon Lami. The air seemed charged with the energy of centuries, a power older than the village itself, bending reality in subtle ways. Doors slammed on their own, windows rattled violently, and shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, reinforcing the presence of a justice that could not be escaped. Despite the horrors around them, Lami herself remained composed, her body a quiet anchor amidst the chaos. She did not step forward to strike, nor did she issue threats. Her shadow did all the work, acting as both sword and sentinel. The surviving elders' cries of despair filled the plaza, each one pleading for mercy, acknowledging their sins and finally understanding the depth of the wrongs they had inflicted. It became painfully clear. Lami's vengeance was deliberate, measured, and unstoppable. This was not rage, this was balance restored. As the morning sun finally rose, its weak light brushing over the village, Lami moved forward a few steps, and the shadow halted in perfect alignment beside her. The black flame knife receded, though it did not disappear, its presence a warning and a testament. The elders remained kneeling, some weeping openly, others paralyzed with fear, and the villagers began to whisper among themselves. No one dared approach, but every eye remained fixed on the handless woman and the shadow that had become the instrument of justice. The gates of the village, which had once symbolized exclusion and separation, now framed the beginning of a new era. Lami, though scarred and marked by cruelty, stood taller than any who had wronged her. Her shadow, loyal and relentless, served as both protection and reminder. The past could not be undone, but the future could be guarded. The villagers sensed the magnitude of her return, not as a victim but as a force beyond fear, beyond harm, beyond the limitations of flesh. By the time the sun was fully risen, the village knew one immutable truth. Lami had returned, and with her, the justice they had long feared. The shadow wielded her wrath, yet the woman herself carried the quiet authority of survival, defiance, and power. No elder dared rise without trembling, no villager dared speak without reverence. The handless healer had reclaimed her story, her place, and her power, and her shadow, the black flame blade at her side, ensured that the memory of cruelty would never again threaten the village. The square was eerily quiet when Lami stepped into it, the same square where she had once knelt, helpless and stripped of her hands under the cold judgment of the elders. The cobblestones, now darkened with the memory of her blood, seemed to pulse beneath her feet as though remembering every scream, every betrayal, every act of cruelty inflicted upon her. The air hung heavy with anticipation, charged with an energy that seemed to vibrate through the walls of every hut surrounding the plaza. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the edges of the buildings, stirred by the will of the handless healer and the darkness she commanded. The council, the surviving elders who had orchestrated her mutilation and plotted against her life, stood at the center, huddled together in a vain attempt to appear strong. Their eyes darted nervously, glancing at every corner, every shadow, as though expecting the darkness itself to step forward and strike. But even they could not anticipate what awaited them. Lami's shadow moved independently behind her, flowing like liquid night, its form solidifying into something terrifyingly precise. A silhouette of herself, arms extended, holding a blade of black flame that seemed to drink in the dim light of the torches around the square. The weapon shimmered with an unnatural intensity, jagged and lethal, and the elders' eyes widened as they felt the weight of judgment settle over them. Without a word, the shadow began its work. From the darkness, the elders' own shadows rose, twisted and distorted, taking on a life of their own. They no longer obeyed the will of their owners but responded to the command of Lami's will, moving with terrifying autonomy. The elders screamed, their cries echoing across the square as the shadows twisted around them, reflecting their guilt, fear, and greed. Each dark figure became an executioner, executing precise, poetic punishment for every act of cruelty committed. A hand that had struck her was mirrored by a shadow pressing down with impossible weight. An eye that had watched her pain with cold amusement was met by a shadowy hand covering it in suffocating darkness. The elders struggled, shouted, and pleaded, but the power of the shadow was absolute, bending their fears into instruments of their own reckoning. The villagers, hidden behind walls and peering through windows, watched in awe and terror. Mothers clutched children, merchants hid behind carts, and even the bravest youths found themselves rooted to the ground, unable to look away. They had long feared Lami's vengeance, whispered about her in hushed tones, but seeing it enacted was beyond comprehension. The shadow moved with deliberation, ensuring that each punishment matched the cruelty once inflicted upon her. This was not blind rage, it was justice incarnate, a perfect balance between the scales of wrongs committed and the power reclaimed. Time seemed to stretch unnaturally in the square. Screams echoed and faded into silence, replaced by the shifting whispers of shadows that wrapped themselves around the edges of the plaza. When the chaos finally subsided, the elders lay defeated, broken not by mortal weapons but by the very essence of their own fear. Their shadows had returned to the service of justice, and their cries had ceased, leaving only the stillness of a square marked by retribution. In the aftermath, Lami stood alone, her arms wrapped in cloth, eyes calm and unwavering. Her shadow remained beside her, towering and regal, the black flame blade held at its side like a sentinel awaiting further command. It had acted as both her voice and her hand, delivering what she had been denied in life but reclaiming in power. Together they surveyed the square, a quiet authority radiating from them both. The villagers slowly emerged from hiding, their faces pale but filled with a newfound respect and fear. They understood that the events of the night were not an act of random vengeance, but a deliberate, measured restoration of balance. The square, once a place of cruelty and humiliation, now felt like consecrated ground. Every cobblestone bore witness to the strength of a woman wronged, every shadow a reminder that injustice cannot stand unchallenged. Lami's presence was more than physical, it was spiritual, a tangible reminder that cruelty carries consequences far beyond what the perpetrators imagine. The villagers whispered her name reverently, the handless healer, the woman of shadow, the one whose vengeance could not be contained. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Lami and her shadow remained in the center of the square, unbowed and unbroken. The air was thick with the remnants of fear, yet also with the promise of justice restored. The elders, those who had once wielded power with cruelty, were gone in influence, their authority replaced by a lesson written not in words but in the living presence of the woman they had wronged. The shadow did not dissipate. It lingered at her side, a constant, silent guardian, its black flame knife a warning to any who might seek to harm the innocent or abuse power again. Lami's eyes swept across the square, calm but alert, understanding that while this battle was complete, the vigilance of shadow and spirit would endure. She had reclaimed her agency, her power, and her dignity, and the shadow, her eternal companion, ensured that justice would remain alive, breathing in every corner of the village where fear and cruelty had once thrived. When the screams and terror faded completely, only Lami remained, standing tall and resolute, her shadow a living emblem of power and justice. The handless healer, the woman whose strength transcended flesh, had become legend, her shadow a queen's guard that would forever watch over the balance between cruelty and retribution.